Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Azim Premji University. We are delighted to present today's program in our series of public lectures here in Bangalore. And public lectures are one of the ways by which the foundation, the Azim Premji Foundation, promotes its vision. All our public lectures, close to 100 so far, are available on our YouTube channel. Please do look it up. I know many of you have come here because you are well-wishers of Azim Premji University and invested in the education and development of our country. And a very special thanks to so many of our students who have braved the 2-hour commute to be here. Thank you all. A brief introduction to the speaker, the interlocutor, and the topic. I'll skip the topic because it's already been covered. Professor Srinath Raghavan's CV was part of the invitation, so I'll just pick a few of the highlights. One of India's finest young historians, Srinath, if I may call you Srinath, yeah. Srinath is a professor of history and international relations at Ashoka University and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to entering academia, he spent 6 years as an infantry officer in the Indian Army. So when he walks up on stage, you will see how from his frame you will make out. Not surprisingly, Srinath was chosen by India's Ministry of Defense to write the official history of the Kargil War. For someone who is just 47, many honors have already come his way. The K. Subramaniam Award for Strategic Studies and the Infosys Prize for Social Sciences in 2015, being just 2 of them. Of particular interest to us Bangaloreans is that Srinath also serves as a trustee of the New India Foundation, which is based here. Our public lectures follow a format where we have the speaker deliver their talk, and then one of my colleagues from the university engages the speaker in a short conversation. Today it will be Professor Khalid Anis Ansari. Khalid is a sociologist interested in post-colonial modernity, democratic deepening, anti-caste movements, and transformative politics. Khalid did his PhD from the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands. A bit about the program for this evening. Soon after this introduction, Srinath will deliver his talk for about 50 minutes. Khalid will then be in conversation with him for about 20 minutes. And at the end, we expect to have around 15 minutes for audience questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Srinath Raghavan.
Thank you, Sadish, for that very kind introduction. I'm very grateful to the Azim Premji University for this invitation, and I'd particularly like to thank Archana for all the help in getting me across from Chennai for this. And thanks to all of you who have braved Bangalore's traffic to be here on a Tuesday afternoon when you should have perhaps been doing better things. But I'm really delighted to be able to talk about this particular topic with you today. This is coming out of a book that I've just finished writing and which should see light of day by April next year. The book is a history of India in what I call the long 1970s. Which is a period that I frame as a transition from the Nehruvian sort of opening, inaugural moment of post-colonial India, starting from the mid-1960s and stretching through to the 1980s, which is when Indian politics, economy, and society start changing in different ways. And I see the 1970s, the long 1970s, as really the hinge on which the contemporary history of India turns. And the book from which I'm going to speak today is really an attempt to give a fairly detailed historical account, but also to suggest some slightly different ways of thinking about this period, which remains one of continuing interest and controversy in Indian public life. The book is not really about Indira Gandhi per se, though obviously she is a very important protagonist. I am as interested in the transformations of the Indian state, Indian politics and democracy, and particularly on questions of political economy, which is what I want to talk about today. Now, what I want to focus on today is really one slice of a story. So there will be things that I invariably leave out. You may just be wondering why I have not referred to this or that thing, which is already familiar to us. Hopefully we'll have a chance to pick up some of those things in the conversation with Khalid. Thanks for doing that. And, what I really want to do is to today talk about this particular moment of transformation in the Indian state and its approach to thinking about development, particularly the question of poverty in the long 1970s. I'll start and more or less finish the talk with the year 1972. In the year 1972, barely 3 months after India had won a major victory against Pakistan and leading to the creation of Bangladesh in December 1971, there were state assembly elections held across India. And this was the first time that assembly elections were actually delinked from the general elections. The general elections had been advanced, and Indira Gandhi had come to power in 1971 with a very strong mandate, after which the 1971 crisis and the war broke out. And in the run-up to the 1972 election, the Congress Party's manifesto naturally spoke a lot on the theme of war and independence. Now, it gave full play to India's decisive victory against Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh and other things. But the manifesto said there is another war ahead. And that war is a war against poverty. And the manifesto said that what we want to achieve now, having given independence to Bangladesh, is Purna Arthik Swaraj for India, right? Now, both of these phrases, war against poverty and Purna Arthik Swaraj, are highly unimaginative slogans which were basically stolen from elsewhere, right? I mean, Purna Arthik Swaraj was a riff on the Purna Swaraj kind of declaration of the Congress Party in its historic Lahore session of 1929. War against poverty was just a turn on war on poverty, which Lyndon Johnson had declared only about 5 years ago, right? Now, commentators then and subsequently have emphasized that this entire phase, which followed on another very catchy slogan that Indira Gandhi had used in the 1971 campaign, a year earlier, called Garibi Hatao, right, was in some ways emblematic of the kind of populist turn in Indian politics under her leadership. Now, I do not think that the concept of populism really helps us to get to the specificities of what exactly this particular change involved. But the way in which this policy or this turn is characterized as populist basically says that this was a moment in Indian political economy when political considerations, especially electoral considerations, were in the driver's seat as far as economic policy making was concerned, right? So in a sense, political economy, politics was very much in the driver's seat in terms of driving it. Now, I do not want to sort of quibble with that particular characterization as much as suggest that we need to have a slightly different sense of what was the political element of the change in political economy in this period, right? And that I would like to suggest today really was a transformation, a very deep transformation of the Indian state's imagination of what constitutes development, how to tackle the question, the challenge of poverty, and how the state and its machinery would actually be mobilized in order to do that, right? I mean, that is the sort of broad transformation that I want to talk about. So, to paraphrase the historian E.P. Thompson, you could say that, Garibi Hatao was electoral rhetoric, but it was not empty rhetoric, right? There was a deep-seated change, which Garibi Hatao and slogans like that were really trying to give effect to and capture. Now, the conventional story runs something along the lines of saying that, Indira Gandhi comes to power in 1966. It is a very difficult time for the Indian economy. You are coming on the back of 2 wars, 1962 and 1965, 2 successive years of drought and famine. And you were in a situation where there was no alternative but to look outside to the United States for assistance. Indira Gandhi did make that effort, but nothing really came out of it. In the meanwhile, there was a widespread recognition within the government system that the whole machinery of economic planning in some ways had unraveled. So the 4th plan was put on the hold. A plan holiday was declared effectively for a 2-year period, right? So the idea was that developmental planning was not something that is viable in the current context. And then Indira Gandhi was herself enmeshed in a series of confrontations with the sort of leaders of her own party, which is what led her to adopt a much more left-leaning stance, of which various kinds of things were done: privy purses, bank nationalization, Garibi Hatao, etc. Right? So that is the sort of conventional story of where the impulse towards this kind of left populism really comes from. I would like to suggest that the impulses for those changes actually were somewhat deeper, right? And that what we saw in this period was really a change which emanated from very deep within the Indian policy-making establishment itself. In fact, the origins of the transformation of this imagination of development and poverty go right back to the nerve center of the Indian state's approach to development, which is the Planning Commission itself, right? And I would like to sort of take us back to certain debates which began within the Planning Commission in the early 1960s, which I believe were really the starting point for some very important changes that happened. Now, this is one strand of the story. The second part of the story that I want to focus on is how does the Indian state come to think about actually sort of finding resources for tackling poverty in this specific way that they decide that they want to do it. And it is there that the story of bank nationalization actually becomes quite important. Now, bank nationalization was taken for political purposes. It was a move which Indira Gandhi made in order to signal that she wanted to make a clean break with the established sort of leadership of the Congress party and chart a very different course. Much of the literature on bank nationalization actually focuses on the fact that it is a very political decision, right? And that it was not a decision which was taken on any economic grounds, which is true as far as it goes. But as a historian, I also feel that thinking purely about intentions of why people did something is not good enough. We also have to understand what the consequences were. What kinds of things actually flowed from something, right? I mean, even in ordinary language, when we use the word someone did something, right? You could think of it in two ways, right? Someone wanted to do something and ended up doing it, but someone actually accomplished something else. And I think the latter part, which is to say a consequentialist approach, reveals a very interesting story which actually unfolded in the wake of bank nationalization. Much of the story is now we can trace it thanks to an extraordinary sort of declassification of materials which has happened in the National Archives. This project is actually based on close to a decade of research on this new documentation which has really been flowing out, which I suggest allows us to get a kind of a much more detailed picture of what things look like from within the belly of the state itself. So the storyline that I'm going to tack on today is Act 1 will focus on debates on poverty, the new conception of poverty, where does that come from, what does that mean, what kinds of implications does it have. And then the second part, I want to talk really about how the bank nationalization story really dovetailed with this and how the two of these came together to form an entirely new kind of development machinery really in order to tackle the question of poverty. Now, we will not have time really to talk about how successful this effort was. I can tell you upfront that it was not particularly successful, but the success in the short or long run is not what I'm interested in as much as making a claim here. And I'll begin with that claim and we'll revisit it towards the very end, which is that that particular way of thinking about poverty and the question of tackling it in some ways left a very deep imprint on how the Indian state thinks about that problem. And I would argue that the way that India today thinks about the problem is very much within the same framework, 50 years on, yeah? So that really is the historic importance of this moment that I'm trying to sort of excavate for us to sort of think about. So let's start with the question of poverty. Now, debates on poverty in the context of India under colonialism go all the way back to the late 19th century, right? I mean, that was the whole sort of economic critique of colonialism with which Indian nationalism really started out. Poverty was an enduring theme. And even for the post-colonial state, obviously the question of poverty and how to sort of tackle it was the central question of development planning itself, right? So poverty and the related questions of unemployment were in some ways the main issues that the whole idea of developmental planning and the developmental state really tried to target. Now, the first 5-year plans, especially the second and third 5-year plans, sought to address the problem of poverty in a somewhat broad-based way. Yeah, they said, listen, the problem is that we are a largely agrarian economy, which is highly unproductive in terms of its agriculture. And what do we do, right? So first thing we want to do is to make agriculture more productive. But at the same time, you want to move people from agriculture to more high value adding activities like industrial sort of production and so on. So you're effectively operating in what economists will call a two-sector Lewis model, is what basically the second plan really was thinking about, right? So what you wanted to do was to make agriculture more productive, transition people to newer industries, much of which would be done under the supervision and guidance of the state, principally because the private sector did not have the wherewithal to be able to undertake these kinds of primary investments and so on. And the idea was that such broad-based growth would generate more employment, higher incomes across the economy. Now, this was very much the received wisdom of the time. Yeah? What the Indian planners were trying to do in the 1950s was standard development wisdom across the developing world throughout this period. There were hardly any dissenting voices. It is only in retrospect that the failures of all of this is acknowledged very much. At that point of time, this is all seen as pretty much standard, right? But the 1961 census really came as something of a wake-up call. In fact, it would not be incorrect to call it a shock to Indian sort of planners and policymakers. Because this census, the 1971 decennial census, showed that population growth over the previous decade was actually at about 2.3%, as against the expectation of the planners and policymakers that it would be about 1.2%, right? So population growth turned out to be double of what the planners had expected. Now, this automatically meant that all your estimates, not just about growth, but also about per capita incomes, etc., were pulled down considerably, right? So there was a huge amount of revision of the statistics that the state had to undertake. And it is in that context, while the third plan is going on, the 1961 census happens, that the Indian development planning machinery really starts thinking hard about how the story of economic planning and planned economic development in India is working out. Yeah? In many ways, the kind of transition that the second plan and the third plan envisioned of moving people from agriculture to industry and other kinds of activities turned out to be far slower and more patchy than their estimates had suggested. Both land reforms, which meant that particularly a large number of people who were in various kinds of intermediary positions between landowners and landless laborers, their position became very insecure through the 1950s. So a lot of people were wrenched out of a stable kind of relationship of work with land. Population growth also meant that land holdings successively across time became less viable because of subdivision across families and so on, right? So what you had, planners realized from the early 1960s, is a large number of people in rural India who were increasingly not finding employment in agriculture or related activities. Yeah? This is the beginning of what the historian Jan Bremen calls footloose labor. Yeah? The slow circulatory migratory labor from rural India to urban India and back, which happens in a seasonal kind of a way. And this really is the emergence of what subsequently would be called the informal sector of the Indian economy, right? So it is the emergence of this and the understanding that the transition that was envisioned as part of India's planned economic development, which was going down, that a new conception of economic planning, particularly the question of poverty and how to tackle it, gradually started uncoiling from within the belly of the state. Now, before we get into the details, I think it may be useful just to give you an outline sketch really of what this change in conception of poverty actually amounted to, right? Now, I'm going to be simplifying considerably here. Yeah? Einstein once said that, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. It's an interesting statement. I think we should try and make it simpler. In any case, economics is not theoretical physics, so we can have a go at it. Now, I think the best, simplest way of understanding what this shift was about is to think of it as a sort of distinction between seeing poverty as a relative condition and seeing poverty as an absolute condition. Yeah? Now, what does the relative condition of poverty mean? We say that the relative conception of poverty is really a consequence of unequal distribution of income. Yeah? poverty as a consequence of unequal distribution of income, irrespective of what is the income of those who are at the bottom of your income distribution. Now, what this means is that you could be, or anyone could be, more or less poor. Yeah? Poverty here is seen as very closely related to the other problem of inequality itself, right? And the policy correlate, which is what the planned economic development, the second plan, etc., attempted to do, was to focus on promoting economic growth. Economic growth, broad-based economic growth, was seen as the way of raising incomes and reducing the state of deprivation, and closing out inequalities over a period of time. So this is the relative conception of poverty. This is the conception that the Planning Commission and the entire developmental state was operating on up through to the 1960s, right? The second conception, which we could say is an absolute kind of notion of poverty, thinks of poverty as an absolute condition, which is to say that it is a condition which is not necessarily related to anything else. It's not relative, it is absolute, it is in its own terms. Now, what this conception does is that it very sharply distinguishes the poor, a category of people called the poor, from the rest of the population, right? So you have some people who are identified through whatever means and classified as being the poor. And the question of poverty is really about doing something to ameliorate the state of deprivation of those people whom we would identify as the poor. The adoption of this alternative conception of poverty led to the emergence of an object of knowledge. It's really something which was constructed. It was not there earlier, called the poverty line. And in time, this particular idea of the poor as being one particular category which is very separated, who could be measured by something called the poverty line, then led to a set of new policies which were really talking about targeted schemes in order to improve the condition of those who were below the poverty line. Yeah? So this is a very different conception of how to tackle poverty from the earlier planned economic model, which really saw poverty as a relative and something that could be tackled by broad-based economic growth itself. You did not need specific targeted anti-poverty programs, so to speak, right? And it is the emergence of this sort of change that I think merits a very important attention. So where did this come from? I've explained to you what the distinction in conceptual terms was, but historically speaking, where did this idea come from? Interestingly enough, it came from the Planning Commission itself. In mid-1962, the Planning Commission sets up a working group to consider what they define, quote unquote, as a minimum standard of living for every Indian. Now, this group included stellar economists who were associated with the Planning Commission at that point of time. People like D.R. Gadgil, B.N. Ganguly, V.K.R.V. Rao, P.S. Lokanathan. It also had a few politicians in it. Minu Masani of the Swatantra Party and Ashok Mehta, who was of the Socialist Party, was part of this exercise. Yeah? This entire exercise was shepherded by Pitambar Pant, who used to head the perspective planning division of the Planning Commission itself, right? So this is a very high-powered committee, actually set up directly under the instructions of Jawaharlal Nehru himself, the Prime Minister, yeah? Now, this working group was the one which first came up with a definition of the poverty line. And its sort of definition, in some ways, flowed into a very important document, which was produced by Pant's, under Pant's supervision, which is titled Perspective of Development, 1961 to 1976. As historians are used to seeing thousands of documents in an archive, any document which has a title as bland as this is never going to stand out, right? I mean, your eyes are almost going to glaze over and you just say, pass it. But it so turns out that this highly blandly titled document was the initiator of this extremely important change which happened at this point in time, yeah? So those of you who are interested in developmental studies, please get your eyes trained to look for the most boring things, because some very interesting things may well be tucked in there. Okay. So let's look a little bit at what this report says, and then I'll come back to that other committee, yeah, the Gadgil, V.K.R.V. Rao, etc. What were those people saying? So the paper began on a sort of a pensive note, right? It kind of says that things are not going as well. The first decade of planning, it says, was unquestionably a period of considerable progress. National income had risen by 40%, but as the census of 1961 shows, population growth was nearly twice the expected rate. So a major part of the additional output, the paper says, and I quote, was neutralized by the rapidly growing population. So per capita income had increased by just 16%. Yeah? So national income had grown 40% over the past decade, but per capita income was just 16% simply because of growth of population. The paper then went on to say that there were other problems, which is that living standards, they said, had improved only very marginally. Per capita annual income in 1960-61, yeah, annual income of every person was around 330 rupees. Yeah? Now that works out, the average per capita expenditure on consumption, right? So average income is about 330. The Planning Commission's statistics and the Government of India statistics showed that average per person expenditure on consumption is about 300 a year, right? So you're just about covering even basic consumption. This 300 a year can also be understood as about 25 rupees a month per person. Yeah? That is the kind of consumption expenditure that we're talking about. People are spending about 25 rupees a month on average. Now, this is just the average, right? Now, the report notes, and I quote, that this is too meager to sustain a standard of living which can be considered tolerable in the modern context. Yeah? So they acknowledge that this is a pretty bad thing. But then they also go on to say that the picture, in fact, is far more distressing because the plight of a large proportion of the population is much worse than suggested by the average, because per capita is only telling you what the average is. Many people are below the average, right? Data with the Planning Commission on the distribution of income and consumption showed that more than 60% of people in India had a level of consumption which was lower than 25 rupees per person per month, which is the average. Yeah, 60% actually were below that average, and about 30% could not even spend 15 rupees per person per month. Yeah? So the situation actually, if you leave the averages out, look at the distribution, is even worse. Now, the Pant paper goes on to say that no country, much less a democracy, can afford to ignore such widespread deprivation. So what do? The stage has now come, the document declared, when we should sharply focus our efforts on providing an assured minimum income to every citizen of the country within a reasonable time period. Yeah? So here you have a very new kind of a goal which is being set, which is to say that we have to provide an assured minimum income within a reasonable amount of time. And it says that economic development is not likely to automatically lift the income of the entire population. A considerable proportion of the people will remain stagnant and improve much less than the average. Right? So what the Planning Commission is slowly coming to a realization is that we need to define something like a minimum standard of living, find ways of ensuring that, and we should not be complacent to assume that just the planned economic development, the whole sort of story of economic transformation in the macro sense, is going to take care of this particular problem. Because there are going to be many people who are going to be much, much below the average, so to speak, even if economic growth happens. Now, the central question, of course, is how do you decide what is the minimum target that has to be set? Now, this was not a target which they thought could be met in the short run. This was a target which they said should be met by 1975 over the next 3 5-year plans, right? So this is not about the here and now, really. It's about looking really ahead. Now, the document sought to present this particular minimum income target as some kind of a technical economic exercise, whereas actually it was deeply political. Yeah? So one option which Pitambar Pant's group had was to look at the report and recommendations of a committee of the Planning Commission itself, which is called the Nutrition Advisory Committee, which had recently submitted a report saying that in order to get a diet with a very modest standard of consumption for people, you needed approximately 35 rupees per person per month. Yeah? So 35 rupees per person per month is what the Nutrition Advisory Committee says. The report itself considered that this is not such a high standard. We are talking really about a floor out here rather than this thing. Nevertheless, Pant's sort of calculation suggested that if the bottom 30% of the poorest people, so to speak, had to earn this much, 35 rupees per person per month, then accounting for growth in population, they extrapolated and calculated that the Indian economy will have to grow between 10 to 12% over the next decade. Now, that is way ahead of the 4% growth trajectory on which India was at that point of time. Yeah? So getting people to a 35 rupees per person per month threshold was more or less impossible under the existing system, right? Therefore, they decided that they would follow the recommendations of the Gadgil working group, which put the minimum level of income at rupees 20. Yeah. Now, why was this done? Why was a choice made of not taking what was seen as an already low threshold suggested by the Nutrition Advisory Group of 35 rupees per person per month, and they went in for the 20 rupees per person per month, which the Gadgil committee sort of recommended? The answer is very simple. In some ways, the Pitambar Pant report itself concedes it, though not as explicitly, which is to say that if they chose rupees 35 as the minimum national income, then more than 80% of Indians would be below the poverty line. Yeah. This would be a damning indictment of the entire planning process if such a figure was announced and put out in the public. Yeah. The good and the great, D.R. Gadgil, V.K.R.V. Rao, etc., who populated this committee, knew that they could not embarrass the government in quite the same way. So what you had, therefore, was not a technical, economic, developmentally driven sort of notion of where the poverty line ran, but effectively a political choice was made to say what is acceptable given existing conditions and various kinds of things. So the definition of the poverty line or the minimum income, which then became the poverty line de facto, came to be presented as 20 rupees per person per month, right? Which is you may say, just a modest 43% reduction from 35 rupees per month. Yeah? Now, please remember, even after coming down to rupees 20 per month, some 60% of Indians were below the poverty line. Yeah? So this is where we are. Now, what exactly was the reason that the Gadgil, V.K.R.V. Rao, B.N. Ganguly group actually came up with that rupees 20? There is no documentary trail which suggests that. I have looked hard, high and low, to see if something can be found. The only thing that I found which is of interest is an article written by an economist called Ashok Rudra, who was a member of was working in the perspective planning division itself and contributed to these discussions subsequently on the poverty line, who actually wrote about a decade later. And I'll quote to you what Rudra says. He says, "What definition of minimum living did that distinguished group use? What statisticians did the statistical work? What data did they use? What assumptions did they use to arrive at the figure of rupees 20? We have failed to get answers to any of the above questions from any published or unpublished sources." Yeah? In some ways, to ask the question itself is to answer it, which is to say that there is no technical work which has actually sort of defined this number. So now, none of this should be surprising to any of you who had the misfortune of being on a government committee. Yeah? For those of us who are historians of statistics, I can see Janvi Phalke here. You will know that statistics, the etymology of the word statistics itself is a science of the state. Yeah? So statistics and the knowledge apparatus, as Foucault and others have told us, are very closely connected with activities of government and state. So there is no reason to assume, therefore, that there is any such technical expertise out there which is devoid of political considerations. And in that sense, this is political economy. But political economy not about electoral politics, but about a change in the state's conception and the particular conceptual framework that we use to think about this very important question of what poverty means, right? Now, the subsequent debates on poverty line have been legion. There's a huge literature. Those of you who are economists or students of economics will know about all the details of various kinds of things. But what is interesting is that in all the follow-up studies to what the Planning Commission did, many of which were commissioned by the Planning Commission itself. Planning Commission got a range of economists to work on this question of how to define it, how to look at better ways of coming up with calculations. The interesting thing is that all of these subsequent follow-on studies said that defining poverty line at rupees 20 per person per month, that it is not very clear what exactly is the rationale, but we will take it as a given. Right? So what happens is that willy-nilly, that tends to become the benchmark against which much of the subsequent studies are done. And the way that the subsequent studies do is to actually pull the poverty line even further down, right? So for instance, Pranab Bardhan published studies suggest pegging rural poverty line at rupees 15. B.S. Minas, another very important economist who was with the Planning Commission, fixed it at rupees 16.66. V.M. Dandekar and Neil Kantrath, who wrote a very important book on poverty in the 1960s. It was published in 1970, done as part of work commissioned by the Ford Foundation, pegged it at rupees 14.17. They said 14.17 is too far from 20, so in deference to the good and the great, we'll put it at 15. Yeah. So what happens is a considerable amount of discounting of estimates of where the poverty line should run, right? Which is pulling it even further down. So when the Nutrition Advisory Committee says 35, you come up with 20, and by the end of the decade, we are talking about 15, 14.7, etc. Amartya Sen, who was, as a young economist, an interesting contributor to many of these debates, quipped that, and I quote, "The Indian poor may not be accustomed to receiving much help, but he is beginning to get used to being counted." Yeah? So what you have really is an attempt at various ways of measuring, quantifying, identifying what is the minimum sort of level of subsistence, how do we put the poverty line, etc. And there is a huge debate. Now, the interesting thing about this debate is that much of it is commissioned by the Planning Commission, but it is also published in other journals, right? So there are journals like Indian Economic Review, EPW, other kinds of volumes where these debates are playing out. So in a very real sense, there is a flowing together of both the policy discussion and the academic discussion on this particular question, right? Now, by the late 1960s, this discussion had started informing the Indian sort of policy debates on various kinds of questions around poverty, principally because of the kinds of challenges that the Indian state faced at that point of time, right? As I said, Indira Gandhi had to deal with back-to-back wars, famines, the fact that this thing. Now, even some of the measures that her government took in order to address this very bleak economic situation confronting the country in the period between 1966 and 68, such as adoption of the Green Revolution, in some ways exacerbated the problem, right? So, for instance, there's a very interesting paper which was prepared by the Home Ministry on the agrarian sort of crisis of India, which basically said that while the Green Revolution is benefiting one section of farmers, principally in 2.5 states, right? Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, there are a number of other farmers who do not have the same kind of benefits of high-yielding varieties, input costs, subsidies, etc., which are coming, right? So agrarian disparity itself is growing considerably, right? And this kind of a way of thinking about who were the people who were getting out of even the net of the Green Revolution and what it meant was something that exercised the government at its very highest level. Now, P.N. Huxar, who was the principal secretary to Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, warned her that agrarian India, and I quote, faces an increasingly widening gap between prosperous cultivators who mostly belong to the irrigated tracts and the small farmer in the non-irrigated tracts. The alienation of these small farmers is a deep malaise which can spread and create social and political tensions in the years to come, right? So Huxar is saying, when we are thinking about who are the people below the poverty line whom we need to support, this is one important distinction that we need to make: farmers in irrigated tracts versus people who are in non-irrigated tracts. Another distinction which emerges in the same discourse is between areas that use high-yielding varieties of wheat and high-yielding varieties of rice, yeah? Because the Green Revolution in rice actually takes a while before it starts yielding this thing, right? So places like Kuttanad in Kerala or Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu, which are actually rice belts, are not seeing the same level of prosperity, and the government and its statistics itself is sort of picking all of this stuff up. The news only got worse as time passed, right? So the first agricultural census is conducted in the year 1970, and it shows that the very small and barely viable holdings had significantly increased over the past decade, right? Again, because of population, subdivision of existing land, etc. The number of landless laborers was also on the rise, right? A subsequent official survey of unemployment threw up more unwelcome news. Number of wage-seeking unemployed laborers was almost twice the figure than that projected on the basis of the 1961 census, right? So the problem of poverty at every level is outstripping the official statistics machinery's capacity to project, to understand what is happening in the story of economic transformation, right? So the state is really struggling to get to sort of grips with reality. So all this meant, alongside this new conception of poverty, that the government slowly comes to the view that what we need is a series of specific, clearly defined, targeted schemes which will look after and try and ameliorate the conditions of those people who are below the poverty line, right? So the poverty line then comes to become the sort of dividing line, and then within those who fall below, you create specific groups for whom specific programs are created. So for instance, the government of India, drawing on experiments in Maharashtra and elsewhere, started an employment guarantee scheme. Yeah? The origins of the MNREG actually are in that scheme, which begins in 1969. There are other states like Gujarat, which give a right to work scheme. A series of other programs are rolled out in the period 1970-71. So there is a crash scheme of rural employment to create work for 1,000 persons per year in each district. There is drought and affected programs. There's a program for marginal and small farmers. So what you see is a series of, so to speak, welfare programs, but which are aimed and targeted at particular groups who are below the poverty line, right? Now this, in some ways, is the kind of new imaginary of looking at the problem of poverty, which is in place, right? But the real question, as Dandekar and Rath asked in their work on the whole question of poverty in the year 1970, was how is all of this going to be funded, right? Where is the money going to come from, given that the country is in dire straits as it is economically, right? Their answer was to impose a 10%, to impose higher taxes on the richest 10% of rural and urban India. Yeah? But Indira Gandhi, for political reasons, was unwilling to look at taxing farmers and other things. That was not seen as a viable project if you were trying to win democratic elections. But it turned out that they had another answer. Yeah? And that answer really came out of the experience of bank nationalization, which brings me to the second strand of this story, which is one. Yeah? So in early August 1969, the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, who had just sort of assumed office some time ago, M. Karunanidhi, sent a very enthusiastic letter to the Prime Minister, and let me quote from that. "I emphatically welcome this bold step of yours," he wrote, "which is perhaps the most significant in the last 20 years of the history of independent India." Yeah? What was Karunanidhi referring to? To the nationalization of banks. Yeah? More than 3 decades later, the historians of the Reserve Bank of India would actually echo the judgment of M. Karunanidhi. Yeah? And let me quote from the Reserve Bank official history, who says, "It remains without doubt the single most important economic decision taken by any government since 1947. Not even the reforms of 1991 are comparable in their consequences." I think this is absolutely true. It is absolutely true, and it is not widely recognized, simply for the fact that we keep thinking that bank nationalization was done for political reasons. Of course it was done for political reasons, but that is hardly where the matter stops. In fact, it is the consequences of bank nationalization, which the official historians are referring to, which are extremely important. For it amounted to nothing short of a complete rewiring of the fiscal monetary architecture of the Indian state itself. Yeah. So again, let me just give you a snapshot of what was accomplished, and then we'll look at how it was done in stages, because it did not get done in one particular go. Yeah. Now, what bank nationalization did was that it tremendously enhanced the infrastructural power, so to speak, of the Indian state, its ability to pull resources out of the society, and then to deploy the same resources in order to manage the problems of society, right? Now, this was enabled by the construction of a new fiscal monetary apparatus, and by grafting that apparatus onto this new imagination in the policy circles of targeted poverty alleviation programs, right? So the bringing together of these two things is what sets the new system in place. So let's start with the construction of this fiscal monetary machine, as Anush Kapadia calls it. Now, bank nationalization, and I'm going to give a very summary account, led to a major expansion of the banking network, especially in rural India. By incentivizing people to deposit their money in banks, what it managed to do is that these bank branches soaked up rural savings and surplus from a large section of society which had actually been out of the formal banking system. A significant proportion of these deposits which were coming into the banking system were then taken away by the government. Yeah? Not stolen, but done in very interesting ways. Now, how did the government do that? It did it by getting banks to buy government bonds. Yeah? Government bonds are basically IOUs which government issues for a certain interest rate. Yeah? Now, in the Indian case, this was done by legally mandating banks to hold a specific quantum of their deposits or assets, calculated as a ratio of their total deposits, in government bonds. Yeah? So banks were told that a certain proportion of what your assets are actually should be held in government bonds. Now, in effect, the government was forcing banks to lend money to that. Yeah? Now, this was done through something called the statutory liquidity ratio, SLR, yeah, which specified the amount of money that banks had to hold in government bonds, i.e., lend to the government itself. Secondly, SLR apart, there is something called a CRR, or a cash reserve ratio, which is the amount that banks had to deposit in cash with the Reserve Bank of India, for which they got no interest. Yeah? Now, the CRR allowed the government to borrow more money from the Reserve Bank directly, right? So what the government did over a period of time was to steadily increase both the statutory liquidity ratio and the cash reserve ratio in order to borrow an increasing proportion of the monetary system's resources and deploy it for various kinds of anti-poverty programs, etc. Right? So the SLR, the statutory liquidity ratio, went from 25% of the total assets of every bank in July 1969 to 36% in September 1985. Yeah? So through the long 1970s, the tremendous hiking up of the SLR which happens. The CRR over the same period goes from 3% to 9%. Yeah? By the end of my period, the long 1970s, which is say around the mid 1980s, the banks, the public sector banks and the Reserve Bank together held 67% of government securities, which means the government of India is effectively borrowing principally from domestic resources, which it is able to corner. And if you include other important entities like the Life Insurance Corporation of India, etc., the nationalized financial sector accounted for 78% of national debt. Yeah? This is a phenomenal machinery for the government to have, because this is not money that is coming through unpopular things like taxation. Yeah? It is money which is basically being extracted from a monetary system that you have yourself captured. Of course, there are limits to it. We can talk about it later. Now, there is a second dimension to bank nationalization, right? The government not only used the nationalized banks to sort of get all of this stuff, but they effectively forced the banks to open branches in rural India, in various parts of India where there were no branches, and by so doing, forced the banks to give loans, extend credit to people and sections of population who are never seen as worthy of credit at all, right? Now, in so doing, the government was effectively getting the banking system to support its agenda of anti-poverty programs, right? By saying that various kinds of things can be given, right? Between 1969 and 1990, some 30,000 new rural banks were opened up, right? Rural lending rates were kept low, so rural borrowers could borrow at lower rates, but their saving rates were higher, right? So what they were doing was to incentivize people to use the banking system, so that banks are then forced to sort of lend to those people. But at the same time, the state is able to siphon away the new deposits which are coming into the system and deploy it for its own purposes, right? So this is the kind of interesting fiscal monetary machine which is created. Now, again, this had limitations in terms of how long this game could go on, but it actually sort of worked. So very quickly, how did this system actually come into being? Because when the banks were nationalized, they were done as a political move. In fact, neither the Prime Minister nor any of her senior colleagues who were privy to this particular move, because it was done very closely, actually had any idea of what to do after bank nationalization would happen. Now, Indira Gandhi's first principal secretary as Prime Minister was a man called L.K. Jha, who is a former ICS officer who had studied in Cambridge and London School of Economics, economic Mandarin, effectively. And L.K. Jha was an opponent of bank nationalization. When he was in her office, he wrote notes to her saying bank nationalization not a good idea. Then Mrs. Gandhi moved him as governor of Reserve Bank of India. And as governor of Reserve Bank of India, L.K. Jha was one of the last people to be told of the bank nationalization because it was known that he was an opponent. But once it is done, it's a done deal. And then Jha had to sort of shape up and help the government out. The only person within the government system who was an economist who at least understood economic issues reasonably well, who was consulted, was I.G. Patel, who was in the Ministry of Finance at that point of time. Yeah. So the situation that the government of India found itself soon after the ordinance which announced bank nationalization was promulgated was like that of that proverbial dog which chases a car and catches up with it and then has to decide what to do thereafter, right? So what to do thereafter then becomes a question. The Prime Minister actually takes a deep interest in this matter. And here I would say that this is somewhat revealing of Indira Gandhi and corrects some of the sort of pictures that we have of her more or less being led on by her nose on economic matters and so on. Yeah? So Mrs. Gandhi actually reached out to a range of people, asking them for suggestions about what could be done to sort of make bank nationalization effective. And among those whom she first turned to was the chairman of Syndicate Bank, T.A. Pai. Right? Now, Pai was a progressive banker from Manipal in Karnataka, and his initial note and thoughts, he was the first person to sort of really get off the block and put his ideas out there, were very influential in shaping this particular way of thinking about what could be done with this system, right? It is not surprising, perhaps, that Pai would later join the Congress party and serve in Indira Gandhi's third cabinet as a minister. Now, Pai suggested two principal objectives. He said, first, broaden the base of banking. He said, banking today is only for some classes. Only the very rich are able to borrow from banks. Banking should be for the masses. Yeah? So he said, from classes to masses was his goal. The second thing he said was that there were very large parts of India which were unbanked, geographically speaking. Pai presented statistics showing that India had just about 12 million bank accounts for a population of 500 million. And half of the existing deposits, which is about 6 million of these, came from just 3 states in India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and West Bengal. He said there are a bunch of 6 states which account for about 40% of India's population, which contribute almost close to zero to the banking system's kind of activities. So he said that it is imperative, he writes to the Prime Minister, that banking should spread more intensively across all states of India. The Syndicate Bank, Pai wrote, had demonstrated, and I quote, how even mobilization of small savings collected daily through small schemes is possible. And he said that if the banking system was able to do this, which was to attract savings from the very poor and people who could contribute only in small amounts, but if they were bought into the net of the banking system, then you would, in about 5 years, he believed, his calculations were that you would have deposits could increase to about rupees 80 billion in 5 years, and that these resources could help in the economic development of the country, right? Which is precisely the kind of things that were done later. On the flip side, he said that, Syndicate Bank, he said, had the highest number of borrowing accounts. That is, they were the ones who were lending out money to most people, whereas banks like the State Bank, which actually had many more accounts, were not doing anything. And again, and I quote from Pai, this shows that banks are catering only to a few in the country. And when we know that nearly 600 accounts alone have borrowed 50% of the total advances, we can appreciate the tragedy of the situation, right? So Pai's point was that banking is a highly class-regulated activity. It is for a very small fraction of Indian rich, and that needs to change. Now, Indira Gandhi, meanwhile, was worried that L.K. Jha, who was an opponent of bank nationalization, might just resign and walk away, right? And that was not a situation that she wanted to deal with. So she wrote a nice letter to him saying, I hope you will stay on, and I shall need to rely on you a great deal, and it is for you to really help us identify priority areas for action and what we could do. L.K. Jha sent her 2 very comprehensive notes on the range of things that they could do, but he, in effect, put his finger on the most important thing. And I will say this, right? So Jha says that banks are required by law to maintain 25% of the deposits in the government securities. This is the statutory liquidity ratio, and 3% of their deposits as cash. Yeah? He says, after nationalization, a progressive step up in the investment of the banking system in government securities will be undertaken to bring the level of investment around 30%. Yeah? So he says SLR, liquidity ratio, should go up from 25 to 30, and CRR too as well, right? Most importantly, Jha told the Prime Minister that all this can be done without any change in the law. Yeah? It could be done through a series of policy measures. Now, this is effectively like telling open sesame to the government of India. Yeah? That is what does the trick. If you can do this, Jha, to his consternation, realized 6 months later that what he was proposing as a long-term plan of increase from 25 to 30 was already accomplished. You are already at 30% in 6 months because the government needs to, once they have understood how the system operates, they're going to go ahead and press it. In fact, Jha leaves the Reserve Bank. He doesn't express any public disagreement, but actually walks away from that situation. Now, the interesting thing again is that Indira Gandhi herself is very closely monitoring all of these things and thinking this through. And I just want to sort of read a little bit from her own notes on this to give you a flavor of her thinking on this, right? After reading Jha's note, Indira Gandhi writes a marginal note in her handwriting. She says, this is a good beginning, And she tells P.N. Haksar, her principal secretary, please read these notes. Yeah? So the idea that Haksar is the one who's usually translating for Indira Gandhi, etc., is perhaps not applicable in every case. Now, a week later, Prime Minister wrote to Jha saying that she broadly agreed with the guidelines you propose, but she has a set of questions for him. And she said, these are things that have just things which came to my mind, I've jotted them down. And I'm going to read out to you what are the kinds of things that she said, the Reserve Bank should look at. And I quote, what would be the most practicable ways of making the common person feel that he has a stake in the development of banking? What facilities can nationalized bank offer to people who do not have banking habits so far to become depositors, particularly the poorer people in the countryside? How do banks propose to reach categories like small farmers, artisans, etc., to show them that they can actually borrow from banks, even small sums of a few hundred rupees for productive purposes? Are the prevailing ideas about opening branches the best even in the new situation? If not, what should be the lines of improvement, right? So the Prime Minister is actually thinking quite hard about what the architecture that she wants to ensure is put into place, right? In fact, in a meeting with the chairmen of the banks which were nationalized in September 1969, she says very, very clearly that this is an issue that is of extreme importance and that she expects the banking system really to rally behind the government's agenda, right? Meanwhile, the rest of the government machinery is now cranking in. Once they have understood what can be done, as Haksar says in a note which he wrote at that point of time, and I quote, with bank nationalization, a major instrument of change has now become available to the government. Yeah. Once you realize what you can do with this fiscal monetary system and rewiring of the state, then a range of other things can be then rolled out. And the Reserve Bank and the Planning Commission engage in independent exercises about what is the amount of growth in deposits, etc., that they can project, which can be done, right? The RBI's economists worked on the assumption, and I quote, that one of the most effective methods for mobilizing deposits is by credit expansion over a wider area, right? This is a very interesting idea, because their entire notion was that if you lend to people, then they will deposit money as well. Right? So the rural branch extension, therefore, has this dual purpose. You want to lend to them, because that is what many anti-poverty programs are saying, that there should be bank credit available to people, etc. But that then allows for their savings to come into the system, which can then be taken all the way up to finance various kinds of programs. Right? So that's the kind of system that comes to be. In January 1960, Haksar tells the Prime Minister that her desire to embed a slew of targeted anti-poverty programs on the newly reconstituted fourth five-year plan was proceeding apace. He says that the Planning Commission has approved an additional outlay of 10.3% in the public sector. Most importantly, he assures her, and I quote here, there will be no addition to deficit financing as envisaged in the original draft of the plan. So this new additional 10% of public outlay, he says, is rendered possible by the larger support now expected for borrowing programs of the government and state enterprises. The vigorous program of branch expansion of branches now proposed will facilitate the larger mobilization of deposits. So you now see how these two strands converge. It is not as if it was conceived of by any one individual or a group of people in its entirety, yeah? But that is the way that the development of a new form of rationality, of thinking about what poverty means, moving from a relative to an absolute notion of poverty, trying to define something like a poverty line, thinking about how to categorize people below that poverty line, what needs to be done for whom, and then finding this newfangled machinery of the fiscal monetary machine, which can then be grafted onto these programs, right? So that is what then brings together the new kind of agenda that Indira Gandhi's government does. And in the 1972 elections, as I said, Indira Gandhi says that the war against poverty is a very important thing. Now, soon after the elections are over, and there the Congress party actually wins very handsomely in all the states. The 1972 elections are a total sweep for the Congress party across the country. Indira Gandhi's secretary, who's an economist called P.N. Dhar, tells her that the fifth plan, the next plan, and its initial rudiments are already being put in place, right? And he summarizes the various kinds of features of that new plan, right? And in some ways, that document is as revealing as the 1961 kind of document is about where the state of collective wisdom within the government machinery was by the year 1972. Yeah? So the plan document says about 2/5 of our population, totaling 220 million, live below the poverty line. Yeah? So already the idea that there is a poverty line, there are numbers, is here. The main causes of poverty were urban unemployment, underemployment, and low base of resources for a large number of people in agriculture. Acceleration of the rate of growth will not by itself eliminate poverty. I quote again, direct attack should be made on the problems of unemployment, underemployment, and massive low-end poverty. The plan said that it laid out a series of what it called basic minimum needs, which would have to be met through a series of special programs. Yeah? This included elementary education for ages 6 to 11, minimum public health facilities integrated with family planning and nutrition for children, supply of drinking water, home sites for landless labor, provision of all-weather roads in every village above the population of 15,000, rural electrification to reach about 40% of the rural population, and improvement of slums in 18 cities across Government of India. It seems to me that there is no more succinct and clear account of the new governmental rationality that is at work and a conception of how this would work. Powered by the new fiscal monetary machine, these welfare schemes really were set sail from about 1972. Now, it's another story that they very soon ran into choppy waters and things did not work out the way that the government expected for a variety of reasons, right? I'll just telegraphically tell you. There was the consequences of the 1971 war, the economic consequences, severe drought in 1972-73, the oil shocks that happened in 74, all of which meant that inflation and other things really took the economy, a series of external sort of meteors struck the economy, and this particular program could not kind of run in the way that it did. But the important thing is that this particular way of thinking about poverty and how to tackle it in some ways became the principal framework through which the Government of India in subsequent years would think about the question of poverty and development, right? It is a framework which remains with us even today. In fact, I would say that this particular way of targeted welfare schemes has now more or less become definitional of what Indian politics is all about. Not just at the national level where the Prime Minister's various schemes are touted for different categories of people, etc., but in every state as well, right? In the recent elections, we saw that the electorate was told that they were labharthis or that they were recipients of the beneficiaries of the benevolence of the state. And that was all done through targeted welfare schemes for particular people, right? Now, what has happened in the 50 years since is a tremendous expansion of the scope of these programs. There is a much greater resource base which is mobilized as the economy has grown more broadly. There are other kinds of new technologies of direct targeting and cash transfers, etc., Aadhaar, Jan-Dhan, all of that story has come in. Incidentally, the idea of Jan-Dhan goes back to the Indira Gandhi period, but that's a story for another day. Now, this entire machinery is now more or less representative of what the Indian state claims that it is doing for most of the electorate and the poor people in this country, right? Now, this is an extremely significant change which we can date almost quite precisely back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when this new paradigm of thinking about poverty and how to tackle it came into being. Now, the fact that it has survived or it continues not just to remain in existence but grow after 50 years is perhaps in its own way an even deeper indictment of the developmental failures of the Indian state. People can be told that you are beneficiaries of various programs, but unfortunately for those in power, in a democracy, the poor simply cannot be wished away. So the problem of poverty continues to haunt the Indian political landscape, and the framework within which much of the politics is organized dates precisely back to this period. Let me stop here. Thank you.
So, thank you, Professor Raghavan, for that insightful talk. What I found interesting in the talk was that you located the so-called populist policies adopted by the Indira Gandhi regime in a certain knowledge production around poverty, which started happening in the Planning Commission from 1962 onwards. So this locus in a certain kind of knowledge production That I found very fresh and very interesting. Now, the key logics, the key moves that you say is, one is there's a change in the conception of poverty from a relative understanding and this notion that there will be economic growth, there will be trickle down, and that will take care, to an absolute imagination where the poor in itself becomes a strong category, and poverty line is discussed, and robust welfareist program for this targeted constituency, the poor, is articulated. And then a financial, fiscal architecture is created through bank nationalization to create resources for these targeted welfare programs, right? So this is the route that you suggest. This is a new paradigm. This is broadly the new framework, and it continues till date in various forms. Now, I'm just curious. So in order to tackle poverty, the standard developmental logic, say, for instance, just for the sake of comparison, take the East Asian economies, right? South Korea, Malaysia, and so on, and also experiences from other places. The trajectory broadly is to go for some structural changes, right? So invest in primary education, healthcare, do land reforms, agrarian reforms, remove the intermediaries between the state and the cultivator, change some kind of tenancy laws, do land sealing, redistribution of land, and so on and so forth, invest in labor-intensive manufacturing, or do strategic devaluation. So that is the route with the Asian tigers, China, and so on. They embraced this kind of logic. Now, if there's a critique, if someone offers a critique, that is Garibi Hatao, or the financial, fiscal logic that's created bank nationalization. If someone says that it's a cosmetic intervention, and it is a compromise to evade the larger structural questions that could have actually dealt with these problems better, right? So one, I would like your response on that, on this broader comparison. Second, I mean, and I understand the limitation. I'm looking forward to read the book. 1970s period, apart from this logic, the broad conceptual logic, it is also a very dark period, right? So if you look how Sanjay Gandhi and his cabal, how he uses the banks to fund their own unproductive ideas, Maruti and so on and so forth, how they benefit the cabal, this group around Mrs. Gandhi. So then the rosy picture slightly mellows down. One has to rethink. So yeah, so just to begin as a beginning of the conversation, if your comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. No, I think you're absolutely right in your characterization of what I was trying to do. The only thing I'll say, Khalid, is I don't think it's a rosy picture, because I didn't even get past the 72 period, which is when all the difficulties really start coming in, right? What I was trying to identify is a very important shift which happens, which I think has very long-term consequences, irrespective of whether they're positive or negative. We can discuss that in just 1 minute. Okay, but let's start with your question, right, which is about the broad sort of. So see, the Indian state in the developmental state in the heyday of planning, especially I would say with the first, second, third, more the second plan onwards, was basically going down a route of import substituting industrialization. You said that, listen, we want to industrialize here, we want to reduce our dependence on external thing. We knew that we had a very large and unproductive agrarian sector. Land reforms had been patchy for political reasons, because land was made to be under the Indian Constitution state subject, so states were allowed to do that. But at the same time, I am not so convinced that the standard critique which is given, which is that if only land reforms had been done properly, which is land to the tiller, etc., that somehow we would have had a very different kind of an economic trajectory. I am actually not that convinced. There is a lot of material which the Planning Commission accumulated on the agricultural question, which actually suggests that that is perhaps too simplistic a reading of what was happening, right? Because as I said, in fact, one of the major reasons why there were so many people who were, if I have to use the Marxist language of primitive accumulation of capital, wrenched out of their dependence on land, it is precisely because of this kind of disappearance of the intermediaries. Because under the older systems, there were various kinds of intermediary status that people had in terms of what various kinds of rights that they had to land, even if they were not owning, right? I mean, it's not, property is not just about ownership, right? It's also about use. There are various kinds of other legal frameworks which can be created around property, which is not just about, ownership. And the fact was that a large number of people in agrarian India found themselves in the 1950s where their relationship with land had become a lot more less secure, thanks to land reforms, actually, even the halting land reforms which had happened. So I think that in some ways, that plus, again, I don't want to sound like a Malthusian, but I think the fact of population growth in that period, in some ways, is a very significant one. Not just because of absolute numbers, but what it means even for places where people have land holdings, how the subdivisions operate subsequently, right? So in a very real sense, those were very significant problems. And so what you had, therefore, is I would not say so much a stuck transition, but a transition which actually led to to this very large informal sector that we see, which is in fact, I think, emblematic of the Indian developmental story. Whatever, 90% of people do not have contracted employment in this country. I mean, so that's an extraordinary sort of feature of the Indian economy, which cannot be taken away by saying that we are the 5th largest economy or whatever it is, right? So I think that was the story. Yes, the East Asian comparison is important, but I think the East Asian countries were much smaller. They operated under lesser democratic conditions. A very important aspect of their model was exports. They were able to export to the United States of America precisely because they were allies of the United States of America. India was a non-aligned country. So there were a range of reasons why I think the East Asian comparison doesn't work. Of course, there is a strong Marxist sense that, capital this was not disciplined by the state. I think that again falters because the real capital is actually public sector enterprises. Why were they not disciplined by the state, right? I mean, at the end of the day. So I think the comparison is instructive, but the story is a little bit more complicated. Now, to come back to your question about 1970s, right? As I said, this developmental, aspiration and these programs and other things are rolled out, but then, 73, 74, you have a system which is there. But even beyond that, if you look at it, by the end of my timeline, which is the mid-1980s, you find that this story of how much you can juice the system that you have created actually reaches a logical end, because at the end of the day, this is like a snake eating its own tail. At some point of time, you cannot eat it beyond a point, right? I mean, which is why from the mid-1980s, under the Rajiv Gandhi period especially, there is a turn towards external commercial borrowing. And that is what then sets you up for your fall, right? I mean, if you were borrowing 80% of your government debt was funded through domestic sources, you would not have had that kind of crisis that you faced in 1990. So I think that model ran its course about what could be done, and then this thing, right? There were other negative consequences, as you said, politicization of the banking machinery, not just Sanjay Gandhi, but all kinds of things. See, because for Indira Gandhi, again, I didn't allude that much to the political story, right? See, once she splits the Congress party, her attempts to reconstitute that party as a party where there are cadres, workers, etc., that doesn't come through. So what you have, therefore, in a funny way, is that the rural bank branches are the substitutes for the absence of Congress party workers on the ground. Because the Prime Minister is now able to claim that this is directly because of me, which in some ways is true. She was the one who took the initiative to really push the system to get it there. So it supported her type of charismatic politics, where she was looking to move beyond party structures, appeal to populations directly, get various kinds of things. But it meant a huge amount of corruption. I think Sanjay Gandhi is actually a very small fraction of what was happening there, right? I mean, there were many more things. The other thing, which again is, I think, the critique that you could make. People, when I discuss this idea with other friends who are economists, they'll typically say, so what do you think? Bank nationalization, was it good or bad, right? I mean, I just feel that at that point of time, perhaps it made a lot of sense, because rural banking extension would not have happened without this. But at the same time, the dominance of the state in this sector meant that other avenues for perhaps rural financing, etc., never really took off, right? So that counterfactual also has to be taken into account. And we can always argue about, what worked. My general view is that things work up to a certain point and then they stop working, right? I mean, nothing can be sort of continued in perpetuity. So there are downsides to bank nationalization and the whole story which was done, not just politically, but also economically. But I think on the flip side, there are clear economic studies. Rohini Pandey and others have done studies which show that the extension of rural networks between 1970 and 1990 did have an effect in terms of
poverty reduction in rural India. I think that correlation is reasonably well established. I don't think there is that much of a debate about whether that could have been done through other means or not is a valid question.
Thank you for the response. I'll just take you beyond the confines of your talk. There's something I just wanted your view on that. So 72 onwards, Indira Gandhi ran into a crisis and then emergency happens, right? And she creates a certain kind of authoritarian framework, does a number of amendments and so on, and then she fails, right? Janata Party, so authoritarianism fails in a way. Janata Party comes with the promise of restoring the constitutional values and so on, and they also fall apart in 1.5 to 2 hours. So even the democratic experiment fails, even the authoritarian experiment fails, and the key crisis, whether that of inflation, whether that of unemployment, it continues unabated till this day. So, I mean, looking from that experience, what would you say young people, I mean, so a lot of young development professionals are here. How should we imagine the policy framework now in order to make some meaningful change on these core issues, which have a long duty they're sustaining, and so on? Yeah.
Right. I mean, let me preface by saying that, I have never studied economics, so anything I say about economics, you should take it with a pinch of salt, right? I mean, except for things like this, which I have kind of, had the misfortune of having to bone up on a lot of economics ersatz to get up to speed. See, as I said, the mere fact that we are still continuing, not just continuing, but in ways tremendously expanding, powering this particular set of targeted welfare schemes, of all varieties, right? I mean, only the matrix of things changes, right? In some ways itself is an indicator that the larger kind of structural transformation story that you said has not played out. The thing I think that mainstream economists struggle to understand is that it has not happened despite the so-called reforms of 1991 and liberalization. That's the reality that you have to accept. Liberalization has definitely improved overall levels of prosperity, enhanced inequality in the country. Things have changed. We are not in the 1970s. We're certainly not there. But at the same time, the problem and its scale are still there. I mean, you only have to look at the fact that, the government is rolling out free rice to millions of households, even in the context of a country like this today, right? At the same time, again, and I speak here as a historian, not as an economist, the poverty line continues to be a point of debate and claim-making on all sides. Earlier this year, the Niti Aayog did a study, and they made a claim that multidimensional poverty, which is the way that the UN tells us to measure it, which incidentally is not multidimensional because only a few dimensions are chosen, and how you choose all of those things is fundamentally political, right? I mean, that is the key thing that we have to understand. There is no economic knowledge out there that we just take. So multidimensional poverty, some 25 crore Indians were apparently pulled out of that in the last 10 years, credit of which should go to the government and its system, right? So in both ways, we see that the same kind of discourse continues. So as you're saying, in some ways, the larger failure is to think about what do we do when such structural transformation is not happening, right? And I think the first thing is to first accept that structural transformation is not happening. There is an enormous amount of debate that happens in this country on formalization, saying that we do demonetization so that more people are bought into the formal economy. That, again, to a historian, seems like you're putting the cart before the horse. Formalization happens as a result of development. You cannot force people to just get formalized. The only thing which will happen is that the informal sector will either get cleaned out or go somewhere else, right? And just because that so-called informal sector is not even available to us. So if, for those of you who are development professionals, I'll say this as a person who only consumes all of this knowledge, is we really need to understand much better about what this so-called informal sector is doing. Your colleagues at Azim Premji University do this fantastic set of reports on this thing, but I think we just need an enormous number of studies further. We need various kinds of more detailed anthropological, economic accounts of what exactly is this entity which is actually so large and whose very presence means that we are not going to have the structural transformation of the variety that we are this thing, right? I mean, perhaps China was the last country to have actually managed that kind of structural transformation. And India is not alone. I mean, there are other countries, but just because we are the most populous country in the world, our scale of problems is just phenomenal, right? So My concern is that, as the aggregate economic story gets more and more played up, as the fact that those of us who are invested in the Indian stock markets actually do very well, we just tend to lose sight of the fact that this transformation or this transition actually has not happened or has happened in ways that are actually historically unprecedented, and that we need to get a real handle on what is happening. And that is where I think development professionals really, like yourself, can do a fantastic job if you can illuminate what actually is pretty much an area of darkness as far as we are concerned.
So we'll take a few questions from the audience. There are a few house rules. So one person can ask only one question. You have to step up if you want to ask a question. Make it as concise as possible. So yeah, please.
And if it's too difficult, you will have to answer it yourself. Yeah.
Please come up if you have. Okay, okay.
So I had a question. You mentioned that Indira Gandhi did not pursue aggressive taxation system for the top 10%. If I feel that if she would have, it would have contributed to the political campaign that she was doing, that is Garibi Hatao, because indirectly she is supporting the poor and they are the widest voter base for her. So why didn't she pursue that taxation system?
Yeah, so just to clarify, that was about top 10% of rural income earners. Yeah, for urban and stuff, taxation, direct taxation did go up. It's actually pretty high in that period. But agricultural sort of interests were left out of the taxation framework state across state. Part of the reason was because, especially in North India, those agrarian groups which were empowered by the Green Revolution also became politically very important, right? So you think of a person like Charan Singh, who's a leader of the Jats and who splits away from the Congress party after the 1967 election and forms his own party, Bharatiya Kranti Dal, which actually is the most important player next to the Congress party through the 1970s. Even in the 1977 election, if you look at the performance of the Janata Dal in North India, to a considerable extent was powered by the Bharatiya Kranti Dal and the Jana Sangh, right? So the big farmers become a very important political constituency. They are a constituency that Indira Gandhi knows she cannot afford to alienate any further. Some of them had already left the Congress, Devi Lal in Haryana, Rao Birender Singh in Haryana. You had a group of such interests which she could not alienate any further, which is why rural India increasingly falls out of any kind of taxation scheme, which is what Dandekar and Rath were trying to say, saying that if people are benefiting from Green Revolution, at least that sliver, let's try and tax them a little bit more. But politically, it was not a running proposition any longer. And that is another aspect of the political change of the 1970s.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was opposition. There was a fair amount of opposition to the bank nationalization, right? So, what was the core issue in the sense? What was I mean their argument? And like you mentioned, Jha, right? He was one of the one who was opposing. So, what was there? Why were they opposing?
Well, I mean, I think their view was that there was no reason for the state to take control of the banking system. Already under Indira Gandhi, even before the bank nationalization had happened, the Congress party had, as a whole, agreed that there would be a framework called social control of banking, which will happen. Which is to say, banks would already be given targets saying that you must employ, open so many rural branches, give loans to people who are below, certain kinds of income levels, and so on. So people like Jha felt that it is better to let the private sector and the private banks run. They would do a better job rather than the government taking control of the thing, right? I mean, so his view was one of efficiency and of saying what needs to be done. But he was not thinking about this particular conclave of issues, which is what eventually ended up. And as I said, in some ways, he played his own part in helping the government design that system. So.
Hello. So the first question is that you said that the government was pushing the banks to give loans in rural India, but in 2019, RBI classified something as priority sector, which actually, like the sectors which come in priority sector are like agriculture, small and medium enterprises. These are actually the sectors which face difficulty in getting loans, and RBI was, encouraging banks to, to give loans to these sectors. So if in 2019 this is the case, then who were getting the loans in 1960s and 70s? And the follow-up question is that banks take money from the public at
Only one question, please.
yeah, it's just a follow-up. Yeah. Banks get take money from the public at 2.7%. Like that's what we get from the bank, right? So that they just pay 2.7%, and then they give loans at 13-14%. So the profit margin is itself 11%. Then why do banks take so little risk? Like why banks don't give loans to this small and medium enterprises or the agriculture?
So, see, the second question is a more complicated one, so I'll pass that. See, the first one, as far as priority sector lending is concerned, it actually goes back to this period of what I was saying about social control of banking, right? From about 1966 itself, 66, 67, sectors were identified for banks in order to be able to focus on lending. That increased considerably as clearly demarcated quantitative targets for banks under the new nationalized banking system. In fact, at the height of the emergency, the emergency had many things going on, right? December 1976, the banks are told that they have to do another major drive of rural bank expansion. Actually, that is the real time when the expansion happens in terms. So, and that happens because the government has, the ability to discipline banks, right? And so this particular framework, again, is very much part of what I'm talking. That's why I'm saying that what was put into place then as the way of dealing with it is there. And the fact that it is not only there, but it has expanded, means that as much as economic growth has happened in its own way in the country, the problem of the poor and the poverty and who needs various kinds of things is also there, right? And as Khalid was saying, at some level it is, you could say it is cosmetic, right? Because you're only trying to sort of retrospectively deal with the consequences of the fact that there is no serious development or employment and various other kinds of things. But you still have to do it. And you're absolutely right that we are still doing the same things. And that precisely was my point, that the framework which was put in place at that time is the one that we are working with as far as the big picture questions of development are concerned.
Archana, do we still have time? Can we take a couple more questions? One? Okay, so one more.
Hello, sir. So, tax is something that decides the fate of an economy. Like, the inequality existing in the society is one of the way we can redistribute the wealth. And we tax it, and then we collect it, and state collects it and redistributes among the disadvantaged group. But balancing that tax and making an attractive destination for the corporates is a very crucial thing. Did you find any sweet spot in Indian economic period as a being historian and economist? And what are some other ways the state can the state can evolve, which it can collect, neither the direct means of tax, but other ways it can collect the wealth from the rich. And putting some data, like in the last 6 months, around 110 billionaires have left away this country for choosing better life. And also, you might think that to evade the taxes, get relief from the taxes. So how can we manage this? Development and growth, attractive destination.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very fundamental question. So I would say that the broad history of taxation in India is that indirect taxes are the ones which are always kind of on the rise. Direct taxation is not the main sort of stay of even taxation. Indirect taxation means whatever, tax on all goods and commodities that you and I consume, which means that it hits the rich and the poor equally, right? Whichever way you define the poor. Direct taxation, which is progressive, slab-based, etc. The number of people who pay income taxes in this country itself is a very small fraction, right? So that itself is a big challenge to begin with. Now, the classic kind of developmental model in the West, especially in the mid-20th century, the so-called welfare states, right, were basically high taxation enterprises which then did universal provisioning. Yeah, that is the most important thing. See, what we somehow, the language itself in some ways obscures the reality of what is happening here. We tend to say that the programs that we are doing are welfare schemes, or that it's a welfare state that we are trying to construct. No, the welfare state was something quite different as it was constructed there. I don't mean to glorify that. I'm just saying it was something very different. What we have here are targeted schemes which are raised simply because we do not have that kind of fiscal resource base for the state to be able to do the kind of universal provisioning of most things, right? I mean, most of your students of development, you'll know that we constantly keep talking about universal provisioning, but that remains a very far dream. What we still have are sectoral, targeted for particular things, because that is what the resource base allows us to do, right? So that is this. Now, the question of industrial growth versus, taxation and so on, again, those are kinds of broad questions where it's not very clear to me that the only reason in India that you don't have, say, okay, let's look at it, right? Over the last 10 years, what is the main problem in the Indian economy? As I see it, it's just stagnating private investment. Yeah. Now, most people in the corporate sector will tell you that this is a highly business-friendly government, or at least they think of it as a highly business-friendly government. If that is the case, then why is corporate India not putting its money where its mouth is? Yeah. So it is not, and in fact, corporate tax cuts were given by this government in its previous term. So the question is not simply one of that, right? There are broader sets of questions about what makes for attractive investment, climate, and so on, right? And even with schemes like PLI, if we want those things to work, then a broader framework of things has to be sort of managed in order to be able to do those things. And I think that is very much work in progress. So what we have, therefore, is a limited fiscal base on which the state operates, with a problem of poverty which cannot be denied in a democratic context in any straightforward sense of the word. So you therefore continue to do targeted welfare schemes. What you now wager on is the fact that there is limited leakage, there is direct kind of beneficiary. But please remember that every targeted scheme, every scheme that does a direct benefit transfer is also a scheme which operates against public provisioning. It is very important for us to remember that these are trade-offs. Yeah? There is no point convincing ourselves that somehow this is a new kind of a welfare state which is being built in this country. I'm really sorry to say that is not where we are, and we really have to think about where we want to go.
So thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, Professor Raghavan. And I thank Sudhish, Archana, Shashwat, and team for organizing this event today. So
Thanks, Khalid. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, sir.